My name is Saffron, and I will never forget the morning my father called to tell me our mother had died. The only problem was that she was sitting 3 feet away from me, stealing bacon off my breakfast plate while sipping her coffee. I quietly put the call on speaker. My brother Connor did not cry. Dad simply said Mom had passed away during the night, that everything she owned now belonged to him and Connor, and that I would receive absolutely nothing. Have you ever had to protect someone you love from your own blood? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't scream into the receiver. I didn't demand an explanation or threaten to call the police. As a high school teacher, I learned a long time ago that panic is just oxygen to a narcissist, and I absolutely refuse to let my father breathe. The smell of warm, sizzling bacon hung heavy in my quiet kitchen, a sharp contrast to the cold, mechanical voice pouring out of my phone speaker. Douglas wasn't mourning. He was delivering a status report. He detailed exactly how quickly they were liquidating the historic lake house Mom had just inherited from her parents. Connor chimed in, his voice thick with unearned arrogance, bragging about how they had already moved her $600,000 trust fund into an account I could never touch. I looked across the table at my mother, Patricia. She was 63, but in that moment, she looked like she was shrinking into her chair, her eyes fixed on her coffee mug. For 40 years, I had watched her yield to my father. People from the outside always wondered why she stayed, why she let him dictate every dollar she spent and every breath she took. But I knew the truth. Her submission was never weakness. It was a calculated survival mechanism. When you are locked in a cage with a man who uses anger as currency, staying quiet isn't giving up. It is simply a way to endure until the door finally opens. But the door was open now. She was sitting in my kitchen, completely safe, and the two men on the phone had absolutely no idea. I didn't feel sadness. Emotion is just bad data in an equation. And I deleted it instantly. I looked at my phone, staring at the call timer ticking upward, and I tapped the record button. My father's voice, full of patriarchal pride, continued to casually outline his own felony. He thought he was cutting me out of the family. He didn't realize he was just handing me the rope he was about to hang himself with. I poured myself another cup of coffee. The lesson plan was about to begin. I didn't waste a single second screaming into the void. Over the next 48 hours, I completely stopped being a daughter and became an investigator. When you teach high school, you learn quickly that you do not argue with misbehaving teenagers. You simply start building a paper trail. I packed my mother into my car and drove straight to the city. We didn't stop at a police station. We went somewhere much more effective. The heavy mahogany doors of Vivian's law firm closed behind us, shutting out the noise of the street and the mess of our family drama. Vivian was 60 years old, sharp as broken glass, and specialized in elder law. She was exactly the kind of loyal ally you wanted when you needed absolute, undeniable process rather than empty sympathy. She had spent 3 decades destroying people who preyed on the vulnerable. When she looked at my mother, I didn't see pity. I saw a brilliant legal mind finding her next target. Sitting in her leather chair, Vivian began pulling the digital records on the trust my mother had just inherited. My mother sat quietly, her hands folded, while Vivian effortlessly bypassed all the emotional arguments and went straight for the hard, federal statutes. She traced every cent of the $600,000. But it was what she found next that completely shifted the gravity in the room. Vivian turned her monitor toward us. It was a property transfer for the historic Georgia Lake House, filed just 24 hours earlier. I stared at the signature at the bottom. It was my mother's name, but it wasn't her handwriting. Connor had forged it, and he had done it on the exact day my father had checked my mother into a so-called stress clinic and heavily sedated her. Looking at that document, Any lingering guilt I felt about ruining my father's life evaporated completely. They had not just isolated an old woman to slowly drain her accounts. They had executed a calculated, illegal property transfer while she was medically incapacitated. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the reality wash over me. Emotion is just bad data in an equation, and right there in Vivian's office, I hit delete on every ounce of daughterly affection I had left. I wasn't dealing with a difficult family anymore. I was dealing with federal felons, and felons do not get second chances. They get indictments. My father and brother operated under the assumption that their timeline was flawless. In their minds, my mother was safely secured in a cheap, out-of-state facility, chemically subdued and entirely erased from the equation. They assumed I was paralyzed by grief, financially frozen, and too weak to challenge their authority. So, they did exactly what toxic men do when they believe they have eliminated their liabilities. They demanded an audience. By Wednesday morning, Douglas had formally blocked my phone number, cutting off any chance of a messy family confrontation. An hour later, he published a long, heavily fabricated tribute on his social media about losing his beloved wife. He used words like soulmate, anchor, and irreplaceable. The comments section immediately flooded with condolences from his wealthy golf buddies and local business associates. Connor eagerly shared the post, changing his profile picture to a solid black square to properly play the role of the devastated golden child. Together, they began organizing a lavish, highly public memorial service at the exclusive Savannah Country Club. It was a masterpiece of corporate-level public relations. They were sparing no expense, likely financing the premium champagne and imported white lilies, using the exact trust fund they had just stolen from my mother. To them, this memorial was not a goodbye, it was a victory lap. They were proudly decorating their own execution chamber, completely unaware that the legal trap Vivian and I built had already snapped shut around their ankles. I sat at my kitchen table, sipping plain black tea, and watched the digital memorial invitation circulate through our extended family networks. A lesser person might have called the police right then, screaming about the absolute injustice of it all. But I did not. An experienced educator knows that if you interrupt a bully too early, the discipline does not stick. You have to let them fully commit to their performance. I closed my laptop, letting the screen fade to black. I walked upstairs to the guest bedroom where my mother was quietly resting. I did not tell her to prepare for a screaming match. I did not try to explain the complex federal fraud charges hanging over her husband. I simply opened her closet door, looked over her clothes, and calmly asked which of her best Sunday dresses she wanted to wear to her own funeral. When we arrived at the Savannah Country Club, I did not rush. I parked the car with the careful precision of an auditor arriving for a final review. We stood outside the heavy oak doors of the main banquet hall. Through the thick wood, I could hear the soft, mournful hum of a string quartet. The air in the hallway smelled overwhelmingly of imported white lilies and expensive catering. It was the scent of a perfectly funded lie. I placed my hand on the brass handle. I looked at my mother. She was wearing her best Sunday dress, a deep navy blue that commanded absolute respect. Her posture was completely straight. The invisible chains she had worn for 4 decades had been entirely severed. She gave me a single, decisive nod. I was not just her daughter in that moment. I was her legal enforcement. I pushed the heavy doors open. Time immediately slowed to a crawl. The banquet hall was packed with at least 100 of Savannah's elite. Men in tailored black suits and women in dark designer silk sat at circular tables, sipping premium champagne paid for by a stolen trust fund. At the very front of the room, standing behind a polished mahogany podium, was my father. He was in the middle of a sentence, dabbing the corner of his eye with a white silk handkerchief. He was praising my brother's incredible strength during this dark family tragedy. Connor sat in the front row, his head bowed in a performance of perfect, fabricated grief. Their arrogance was a terrible investment, and the market was about to crash. We took our first step down the center aisle. A waiter by the entrance saw us first. He stumbled backward into the soundboard, and the string quartet music abruptly cut out over the speakers. The sudden, suffocating silence swept through the room like a physical wave. Halfway down the aisle, a guest at table 4 turned her head. Her jaw went slack. The silver dessert fork in her hand slipped through her numb fingers. It dropped and hit the solid marble floor. Clink. In a room of 100 people, that single, sharp sound echoed like a judge's gavel. It was the exact moment the illusion shattered. Heads began to turn, one by one, following the sound, until every single eye in the room locked onto the center aisle. My father stopped speaking in the middle of a word. The microphone amplified his sudden, sharp intake of breath. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Emotion is a liability, and my ledger was completely clean. I simply watched the micro-expression of absolute, paralyzing terror wash over his face. The color drained completely from his cheeks. His hands clamped onto the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning entirely white. He was staring at a dead woman walking toward him, and in that exact second, he realized his total bankruptcy was not just inevitable. It had already arrived. The total silence in the banquet hall was absolute. It was thick and suffocating. The kind of quiet that makes the air feel heavy in your lungs. For my entire life, Douglas had controlled every room he walked into with the sheer volume of his voice. He was a man who used noise to bend reality to his will. Now, standing behind the polished mahogany podium, he could not form a single syllable. I watched his hands grip the edges of the wood so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He stepped down from the stage, his perfectly tailored black suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big. He rushed down the center aisle toward us, his polished shoes squeaking slightly on the marble floor. His hands were raised in a frantic, placating gesture. He did not project his voice. For the first time in 40 years, my father whispered, "Saffron. Patricia, what is the meaning of this?" He hissed, his eyes darting nervously toward the murmuring crowd of his elite friends. "This is a terrible misunderstanding. We can discuss this in private. Do not ruin this family's reputation in front of my guests." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice or offer him a single tear. I kept my demeanor completely calm and dignified, knowing that my ultimate revenge relied entirely on the cold precision of my words rather than screaming or crying. I looked at him the way I look at a student who has just been caught cheating on a final exam. He thought he was untouchable, but he was just incredibly sloppy. "There is no misunderstanding. Douglas," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. I did not call him Dad. That contract was permanently void. I walked right past him, leaving him stranded in the center aisle. I stepped up to the podium. The microphone picked up the quiet rustle of my clothes. I unplugged his laptop from the projector cable. The screen behind him flashed blue for a second before I connected my own phone. I did not give an emotional speech about how much he had hurt us. Instead, I delivered justice by documentation, relying entirely on clean, undeniable paperwork. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as a high-resolution scan of a property transfer deed illuminated the dark room. "This is a transfer of ownership for our historic family lake house," I announced to the room, pointing to the bottom of the screen. "It is signed and dated 48 hours ago. It authorizes the immediate liquidation of a $600,000 trust and transfers all real estate directly to Connor." Connor stood up from his front row seat. His face was the color of wet ash. The problem, I continued, tracing my finger under the blue ink on the screen, is not just that my mother was heavily sedated at a clinic when this was supposedly signed. The problem is the notary stamp. Take a very close look at the seal. I zoomed in on the document until the blue ink filled the entire screen. I did not need to bore the crowd with complex legal terminology or digital forensics. I just needed one mundane, undeniable fact that proved the forgery. That notary stamp belongs to the Oak Street Bank branch, I said, my voice completely level. The county demolished that building 3 years ago. You cannot notarize a legal document at a bank that is currently a paved parking lot. The room erupted into a chaotic murmur. Douglas stood entirely frozen in the center aisle, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He turned to look for Connor, but my brother was already backing away, trying to slip out the side exit. He did not make it. The heavy oak doors swung open, held wide by the club manager. 2 county sheriff's deputies stepped into the hall, their silver badges gleaming under the expensive chandeliers. The lesson was officially over. Douglas did not surrender gracefully. Toxic men rarely know when they are beaten. They only know how to escalate. 72 hours after the disaster at the country club, I was standing on my front porch, drinking a cup of black coffee, when a white police cruiser pulled into my driveway. It was followed closely by my father's luxury sedan. Douglas stepped out of the car. He had managed to find a new, incredibly expensive-looking attorney who clearly did not know the full story. My father's arrogance had miraculously returned, artificially inflated by the presence of law enforcement. He marched up my walkway, waving a thick stack of legal papers, pointing directly at me while speaking to the police officer. He claimed he was filing an emergency guardianship petition. He told the officer, with a perfectly practiced tremor in his voice, that I had kidnapped his mentally unfit wife. He stated that my mother lacked the cognitive capacity to make her own decisions, and that for her own safety, she needed to be returned to his custody. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to argue with a man who was already legally and morally bankrupt. I simply set my coffee mug down on the wooden porch railing. I turned around, walked into the house, and returned 30 seconds later with a single manila envelope. I did not hand it to my father. I handed it directly to the police officer. Inside was a comprehensive, fully notarized psychological evaluation from an independent state medical board, declaring Patricia completely sound of mind and entirely capable of managing her own affairs. But the critical detail was not just the doctor's signature. It was the timestamp at the top of the page. The evaluation had been completed and filed exactly 24 hours before Douglas hosted her fake funeral. The hired attorney leaned over the officer's shoulder to read the document. I watched the exact moment the lawyer realized my father had just tricked him into submitting a fraudulent petition to a judge. The attorney did not argue. He did not say a single word to my father. He just turned around, walked straight back to his car, and drove away, leaving Douglas standing entirely alone in my driveway, his mouth open and his hands empty. The final collapse of their empire was swift and absolute. I did not have to lift another finger. The federal justice system handled the rest. Connor was indicted on multiple counts of federal wire fraud for forging the property transfer. He found himself drowning in legal fees he could no longer pay, and the golden child was finally forced to face the consequences of his own entitlement. Douglas lost everything he actually cared about. He was permanently stripped of his elite country club status. The people he had spent 4 decades trying to impress suddenly stopped returning his calls. To keep himself out of federal prison, he was forced to completely liquidate his remaining assets to cover the court-ordered restitution and legal penalties. The man who had spent his life controlling everyone else's money ended up with absolutely nothing. A month later, I stood on the back porch of the historic family lake house. The morning air was perfectly clear, and the surface of the water was as smooth as glass. There was no screaming, no manipulative phone calls, and no walking on eggshells. There was only profound, unbreakable peace. Inside the sunlit living room, my mother was standing on a small step stool. She was carefully winding her late father's antique grandfather clock. It had sat broken and completely silent in the corner for over a decade because Douglas had always claimed it was too expensive to fix and too annoying to listen to. She gave the brass key one final, decisive turn. She closed the glass door and stepped back. The heavy brass pendulum swung to the left, then to the right. The deep, steady ticking echoed through the empty halls. Time was finally resuming on our own terms. I realized then that cutting toxic roots is the only way a family tree can actually survive. Sometimes the people demanding your loyalty are just looking for a shield to hide behind. If you have ever had to burn a bridge to stop yourself from being dragged under, drop a 100 in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories of ultimate karma.